Welcome to Table Talk and Tumbleweeds, coming to you from beautiful downtown Wheatland, Wyoming.
Where the wind is strong and the spirit is stronger.
I'm Pastor Joshua of Covenant Lutheran Church.
And I'm Pastor Lisa of the Wheatland United Church of Christ. Table Talk and Tumbleweeds is a weekly discussion that focuses on issues and concerns in the context of the Christian faith. We believe the gospel meets people where they are, and where we are is rural Wyoming. This show is about what the world looks like in this place and what our faith offers this community and what this community has to teach the rest of the church.
You can find us at KYCN 92.7 at 11:30 every Monday. And if you miss a show or if you want to listen again, you can find us at Table Talk and Tumbleweeds wherever you get your podcasts.
We also have a website with all of this information. It's ttnt.org, and you spell out the and. So today on our show, we're going to have our first Ask the Pastor segment, and it's where you get to ask us questions and we try to answer. Our first segment is a question who comes from someone in the community whose family now includes a member who is Muslim, that is, someone who practices Islam. Now, this person told me that they know Muslims worship the same God and that Muslims believe in Jesus, even though they believe Jesus is a prophet, not the Christ. But that's about it. And they wanted to know a little bit more. They wanted to understand a little bit more.
So this is a really good question, and it's one we're going to try to answer as best as we can. But we need to know we are not experts in Islam. We are Christians who are going to take this question seriously, because this is not a question about who is right. This is a person who's a member of your family who you're going to learn to know, learn to love. And so we want to talk about relationship, not controversy. This is someone who is part of your family. They are Muslim, and you are learning to understand them better. And that's a worthy goal regardless of anything else that comes out of this.
Amen. Amen. And really, I think I want to note that they already started with knowing the most important thing that I think is the most important thing, which is that we worship the same God. We worship this God in a different way, but it is the same God. And so we kind of felt that might be a good place to start. And that's why the passage that we chose for today is Genesis 21, 8 through 21, which is the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael, because it really shows this connection and emphasizes this idea that it's the same God.
Yeah. So we're in Genesis 21, 8 through 21, and this is part of a longer set of stories with Abraham and Abraham's rise as a patriarch and the gift of the promise, the covenant, through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and so on and so forth. But before all of this, Abraham has another child with Hagar, the slave woman. She's had this child. She's named him Ishmael. Ishmael means God hears. And he's raised this child, and then the promise comes, and Isaac is born to Sarah. And Sarah is anxious. She is afraid that she's going to lose what belongs to her. And so in verse 10, she tells Abraham, "Cast out the slave woman with her son. She will not inherit along with my son Isaac." And Abraham is distressed, as he should be. But God tells him, and this is verse 12, God says, "Don't worry about this. Whatever Sarah tells you, do what she says, but because Isaac will have offspring for you, but I will make a nation of Ishmael, because he is also your offspring." He gives Hagar and Ishmael a water skin and some food, sends them out into the desert, and they go into the wilderness. And when the water is gone, she puts the child under one of the bushes, and she sits down about the distance of a bow shot. Now, this is a strange sort of unit of measurement about a bow shot. What we tend to argue is that this is far enough away she can't hear the child cry, because she says, "I cannot watch my child die. I cannot hear my child die." And here is where God hears. That's verse 17. And this, remember, his name is Ishmael. God hears, and God hears him. And so the angel comes down from heaven and says, "Lift him up, take him by the hand. God will make him into a great nation." And she sees a well. And she goes to the well, fills the skin with water, gives the boy a drink, and they survive, which is not the way that you would expect when you get exposed into the desert. And so they grow up in the wilderness. He becomes an expert with the bow, and they grow up in the wilderness of Paran. So that's the end of the story, at least as we have it here. Mm-hmm. But the question then we want to say is, what does this text say about the relationship between Islam and Judaism and Christianity?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we want to do is maybe start with thinking about how Muslims read this story, and really part of the emphasis, no surprise here, is that part of what's interesting in this story is that Ishmael is blessed by God, and God tells both Abraham earlier in I think verse 17, but then also repeats the promise to Hagar and says, I am going to make this boy into a great nation, much like the promise that he'd made to Abraham and then later to Isaac. So Islam traces the lineage of the Arab peoples and the Prophet Muhammad through Ishmael. So for Muslims, it's not a story about expulsion and loss. It is, like much of the Abraham story, a story about God's faithfulness. And in this case, it's God's faithfulness to Hagar and to Ishmael, right? These are people, she's a slave, right? She is cast out because Abraham can. He can just say, I don't want you anymore. Take the kid out in the desert. Here's a bag of water, right? And so she is quite literally the slave and her son, people who can just be tossed out when you don't need them anymore, right? But God does not abandon her. The wilderness is not where she goes to die. The wilderness is where God acts.
Absolutely.
And I think this is a powerful resonance with other parts of the Hebrew Bible, right?
And even into the Christian tradition, where Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness. The wilderness is where God acts.
Yes.
The wilderness is where God teaches. The wilderness is where God saves.
Yeah, so you have very much this wilderness emphasis in this story, right? And I think the other thing to notice is that in the Genesis story that we're reading, Hagar appears and then disappears, right? Hagar is not a bit part. She is a prophet-like figure who receives the divine promise directly, right? God speaks to her through the angel and says, I will do this, right? So in Islam, she is honored as a woman of extraordinary faith who trusts God in the middle of this impossible situation. So Ishmael's survival and flourishing is not a consolation prize. It's not something that God does so that Abraham doesn't look bad, right? This is a covenant fulfillment. God has made this covenant with Abraham and now with Hagar and Ishmael, right? God is keeping the promise that he made to Abraham in Genesis 17, right? I will make him fruitful. He will be the father of 12 rulers, right? This is in Genesis. So even though Hagar and Ishmael sort of disappear from this account, it is not the end of their story. For Islam, it's where the story of Islam as a nation begins, and the Quran continues that story. So kind of the interesting thing here is that, as in much of the Hebrew Bible, it is a tale of two brothers, right? So you have this idea of two brothers that shows up throughout the Hebrew Bible, all right? Cain and Abel, I mean, it goes on, right? So, and Ishmael is Abraham's firstborn. He's the one that should inherit. Isaac is the second child born to inherit. But in the Hebrew Bible, continually, the covenant promise goes not through the firstborn, but the secondborn. And then you have that happening the same way in this story, right? So
I'm the second. I have to say, I'm the second of two children, two boys. And I love the stories over and over in the Hebrew Bible where the second son comes out on top, because it's constant and it's consistent, and it's not the way that the world usually works. But I can point to the Bible and say, no, I'm supposed to be in charge. My brother does not like that.
At least you can point to the Hebrew Bible and say that, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's continually the second son, and so even though Isaac is the second son, he is the one that inherits the problem. But I think it's worth noting that there's not one promise here, right? That God can promise to more than one person, right? So God makes a covenant promise with Abraham about Isaac, right? And we know how that works out. But God also makes a covenant promise to Abraham and then to Hagar about Ishmael. So it's not like two brothers fighting over the same inheritance.
There's enough in God's love and power to take care of everybody.
Yes. It's not like God picks, it's not like there's a finite number that God can love and choose. It's sort of tempting at this point maybe to go into the Quran and talk a little bit more about the Quran, because the Quran says a lot more about what happens and also more about Abraham. But I think at this point, astute listeners will be saying, hey, wait a minute, you've been talking about Judaism, you've been talking about Islam. Where do the Christians fit in?
And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We can certainly argue, if we go back in history, we can say that the first Christians are Jews. That's easy.
Right.
But then
They
we have to
inherit
ask,
the promise. They inherit the promise because they're Jewish.
right. But then things get a little bit broader than that. We have to ask, what about the Gentiles? Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. He heads to Antioch, and then he heads into Asia Minor, and he heads to Greece and Rome, and he basically says, anyone who wants to be, we want you in our group. We want you to be a Christian because God loves everybody. Like we said, God's love is larger than any one person. And so Paul goes out and he tells everybody, you should love God the way that we love God. It's wonderful. And it is. And so Paul goes to all these places, welcomes all these people. There's a big fight about it in the book of Acts. And Paul's theology shows up best in this book of Romans, where he tells everybody in chapter 11, consider an olive tree. And if you've ever seen an olive tree, you can see that they're not straight up and down. They're not pine trees.
They're bushy.
They are bushy, to say the least. They have branches that go this way and that way and every which way. And he says, consider the lineage of Abraham like an olive tree. Certainly there are branches that go this way and this way, but also one of the things you can do with an olive tree is you can graft in wild branches. You don't replace the original tree, you add in a new branch, and it grows and it produces fruit and it draws life from that very same root. And that's who he says these Gentile believers are. And I have to say, for most of us as modern American Christians, that's who we are.
Yeah.
We are these grafted in peoples. And so we have this new family structure where you have the expelled firstborn, which is Ishmael, which produces Islam. You have the legitimate heir, which is Isaac, who produces Judaism. And then you have this adopted child. Christianity is grafted in not because we are part of that promise, but because of the covenant Jesus makes with us. And so we are grafted into this same root, 3 different ways, but still the same root. We share the same ancestor, we share the same God, we still love the same God, but as with different branches, different sons, we do different things. You know, I ended up a pastor in rural Wyoming, and my brother is an urban math professor. We're still brothers.
Yeah. So you really have this idea of the Abrahamic traditions, and that is what it's a better term, I think, than Western religions, but the Abrahamic traditions called that because we all trace our lineage to Abraham, firstborn, legitimate heir, quote unquote, and then the adopted child. So this is the children of Abraham as a blended family.
Yes, very much so. And so,
yeah.
So now it is probably at this point worthwhile to spend a little bit of time talking about the Muslim tradition, simply because that's the thing that we might not be very familiar with in our world. But it's also worth saying that Muslim tradition is not a monolith in the same way that Christianity is not a monolith. So we're going to have to be a little careful on this one, and we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, you're right. I mean, different practices are different things, but it's sometimes helpful to get down to the core of what makes a Muslim in the same way that you can say what makes a Christian a Christian. Well, a Christian is a Christian because they believe Jesus is the Christ, right? And it's why Muslims are not Christians, because they believe that Jesus was a very important prophet, but that he wasn't the Christ. And I think maybe I'll touch on that point again in a minute, but I want to start with kind of the basics of Islam, Islam 101, really, which is the 5 pillars of Islam. And the first pillar, it's the central pillar. It's the one in which everything else stands or falls. And that's the Shahada, where every Muslim in their life must at one point say with complete and utter sincerity and conviction, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet or messenger, depending on how you translate that word. It's not a creed. There's not a whole lot that flows out of that. It is just a simple, absolute commitment to the idea of one God and to Muhammad's prophetic authority. And they say it many times during the day. You say it to say thank you, say it when you're in trouble, but you have to say it at least once with pure and utter conviction. It is that moment that you submit yourself to that God. And that is what a Muslim means, one who submits. The second is what's called the Salah. They pray 5 times a day, dawn, midday, afternoon, sunset, and night. There's rules for how you do it, the prescribed postures. And one of the rules it has to be clean ground, which is why Muslims will have a prayer rug, right? So they can sit on it, so it's clean, it's taken care of. Some of them come with compasses, which I always thought was kind of cool. And what the compass does is help them know which direction Mecca is, because they pray towards Mecca because that's the holy site of the Kaaba. And I have out in the wild, out in public, been at public events where you will see someone going off into the corner, laying out their rug, kneeling, and I've always been really impressed because there's this idea. This is someone who is willing to walk away from the football game, to walk away from the concert, to walk away from whatever they're doing, to take a moment to kneel and to turn, and to just take a moment and say, thank you, God, for your blessings. And this moment, every moment of every day, there's a rhythm in which God is there all the time. And I think it's an incredible practice, but there's also this idea that they're all facing in the same direction, right? All Muslims everywhere in this moment are stopping and sitting down and turning in the same direction.
There was actually a moment where we sent a Muslim astronaut to the ISS, and we had to figure out, what exactly does he do? Because remember, the ISS circles the Earth every 90 minutes. And so does he have to, every 90 minutes, do 5 different? So there was actually real serious, take this seriously, an argument about what does he do for these 5-a-day prayers? And also, where does he point? Right? On a spacecraft that's moving that fast, Mecca moves.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting question. And part of this, I'm not saying this is funny, I'm saying this is taken seriously. This is a thing that they say, this matters.
So that's the 5 daily prayers. The other is zakat, which is almsgiving. And the almsgiving, it's a lot like tithing in the Hebrew Bible. So a certain percentage of what you earn goes back into charity. In part because Muslims and Jews share this conviction that what we own is not ours. We are taking care of it for God. That God gives it to us in order to share it. So that's almsgiving. The fourth is fasting during Ramadan. Again, something that people are familiar with, and it's a complete fast from dawn to sunset. So depending on what time of year it is and what part of the world you're in, that can be a very long day. Don't know what Muslims will do on the polls, but anyway, it's a complete fast. No water, no smoking, no food, no sexual relations from dawn to sunset during the entire lunar month of Ramadan. And that month changes, but anyway, it's broken in the evening where people sit down usually with a communal meal and they'll do something together after sunset. I remember once someone telling me that they actually gained weight during Ramadan because all you're doing all day is you're thinking about what you're going to eat tonight.
and it's a celebration when you break your fast. So it's a big meal.
It's a big meal. It's a big meal.
Right before you go to bed.
And anyway, so I will note that as with most of the other aspects of Islam, that people are, if you're ill, if you're pregnant, traveling, or you're doing something else in which it would be impossible for you to fast safely, you're exempt, although sometimes there's provisions for what you can do instead. So that's Ramadan. The final one is the Hajj. Again, something that most people are familiar with, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. Every Muslim, at least once in their life, who is physically and financially able, there's those exceptions, is to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. So every year, millions of Muslims converge on Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia, and they perform a sequence of ritual over several days. I won't go into all of it, but then they also do the walk between the hills of Safa and Marwa, and they're doing that to reenact Hagar's search for water. So again, as I mentioned earlier, Hagar becomes very important. She remains very important in the Muslim tradition. So every Muslim who makes this pilgrimage in a very real sense is walking in Hagar's footsteps, right? They are remembering Hagar's act of desperation, which then becomes an act of devotion and acceptance. Anyway, it's perhaps another little story about the pilgrimage. Malcolm X, probably one of the more famous Muslims, but the Black Muslims are not considered Muslims by the Nation of Islam is not considered Muslim by standard Islam, in part because they believe in separatism. right? And separatism has no place in Islam. No one is better than anyone else, at least officially, right? That everyone, when they're going on the Hajj, wears the same white garments because you're erasing distinction of wealth and nationality. And Malcolm X, and this was not too long before he died, his vision was when he finally made his pilgrimage, he was looking around and he says, oh my gosh, there's this blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy over here who is making the pilgrimage to Mecca, and we are all kneeling at the same time. There are these people from around the world, Black and Asian, South Asian, they're all worshiping Mecca. There is no such thing as separatism. We are all Muslims, right? We are all united under God. And this is so this is his break with Nation of Islam, which didn't work out so well for him. Well, so that's kind of the basic of Islam 101. And I think everything we've said so far, the Abraham story and everything, has really revealed a lot of the connections between Christianity and Islam.
Yeah, the story really shows these strong connections between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And the main connection is that we have the same God. The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is the same God who is the God of Ishmael and Muhammad, and is the same one who is the God of Jesus. This matters.
Yeah, and I think it in the story, what we share is not just that this is God, but kind of who God is and what God is like. I mean, obviously, this is a creator God. This is the God that we all share, but it's also the God who hears and the God who cares, right? And in this story, we see that God sees and hears and cares about the marginalized and the forgotten, Hagar and Ishmael. The great gospel hymn, right? His eye is on the sparrow, not because the sparrow is the most awesome, right? But because the sparrow is just the least regarded, I guess, in some ways. It's not like it's the bald eagle, right?
Two sparrows sold for 1 penny.
Yeah. So both Islam and Christianity center on the God who attends to the suffering and the experiences of people on the margins, and I think that's powerful.
Yeah. We also all claim Abraham as an ancestor and model of our faith.
Right.
We call these the Abrahamic traditions.
Yep.
All of these traditions look to this same figure, this same story, this same man as an exemplar of trust and of obedience. So one thing you will commonly hear a Muslim say is inshallah, and that Allah at the end is cognate with El in Ishmael. And they say, if God wills. They are showing that same trust that Abraham models for them in Genesis. It's in the very rural dialect. It's if God is willing and the creek don't rise.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, right? We put our hands in the trust in God's providence, not necessarily in our own work and our own labor.
Yeah.
And we also often see religion as what we believe, and this is a thing we've inherited, that religion is about belief and faith, and in some ways it is. But it's also important to say, what does it look like in practice? How is religion lived out in your life? 4 of those 5 pillars are about practice, not about belief. Now, it flows from the belief.
Yep.
But it is about practice. It's about how do you do this thing that you've claimed that you believe.
And I think that this is something that we can learn from Islam, that the basis of our unity is our commitment to God, not to a particular version of the truth.
Because our religion is lived.
Yes.
And so we don't have to be monolithic. We just have to live faithfully. And that's the thing we can learn from this Islamic tradition, because they're not monolithic at all. Just like Christianity, there's incredible diversity across cultures, traditions, interpretations, and even just where you live in the world makes a difference. An Indonesian Muslim will not be the same as a Moroccan Muslim, which will not be the same as an American-born Muslim. And that's actually a strength, to be able to say, I am like this person, even though we do things differently.
Yeah, and that's where the unity of practice. We're different, but we pray together every day, and therefore we're still Muslims. And I think, again, that's important. And then, of course, that other connection, which we sort of hinted at, but I just want to bring to the fore a moment, is that, prayer, charity, care for the poor. These are very important for Christians, and sadly, they're not always the source of Christian unity. But yeah, the fact that we work together with other Christians to do good in the world, and that can also be a source of unity. Yeah.
So if we've talked about things that are the same between Islam and Christianity and Judaism, The question we ask, especially for this person who prompted this question, who asked us about how do I live with this Muslim person in my family, is so what is our differences? And there's some pretty
Right.
big ones.
Well, there's one big one, right? In a word, the difference is Jesus. Muslims believe in Jesus; they accept Jesus as an important prophet. But Christians say that Jesus is the Christ, right? I mean, to be a Christian is to say Jesus is the Christ. Now, we sometimes disagree about the particulars of what that means, but we believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, fully human, fully divine, crucified, risen. Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, and that's the sticking point. This whole idea of the Trinity. You know, the Quran says specifically, God does not beget and is not begotten. God is singular unto God's self, complete and whole, right? And to say God that has a son or that God shares divinity with the Christ is to compromise the absolute oneness of God. It's the central commitment of the faith. And Muslims, Muslims think we're polytheists.
Because of our doctrine of the Trinity, which we've talked about on Trinity Sunday. Arius, who's a Christian of the 4th century, declares God is absolute, and being complete, perfect, absolute cannot change, cannot do a handful of other things, and one of those things is cannot make other gods. And so God creates the Son. He's the first and greatest of God's creation, but not co-equal, not co-eternal. This is Arius's claim. And the famous words are, there was a time when he was not. And this is, in fact, what brings about the Council of Nicaea, that brings us the Nicene Creed, was this argument over, well, what exactly is this Trinity thing? How does this work? How does this make sense? And it produces the Nicene Creed. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. This is not just wonderful poetry. This is doctrine that is made in part to deal with this accusation of polytheism. And so Arius gets rejected. His statements about, sort of this co-God thing, it doesn't go away, but he has enormous influence. And yet we do reject what he says and say, no, we are monotheists. We just kind of have to deal with this Trinity idea at the same time. And I think we should also save Trinity for a different time.
I was just going to say that the Trinity is we should save that for another time. Muslims believe we're polytheists, but I think it's important to know that there are a lot of confessing Christians who get the Trinity wrong. There are a lot of confessing Christians who, when they talk about God, sound more like Muslims than they sound like Christians. And that, so I think if we were to put forward the Aryan notion of God, which most Muslims would agree with, I think most Christians would say, yeah, that's what God is like.
We're going to talk about Trinity later. We're not going to get into this right now. But the conversation is an opportunity to say, okay, this is what I believe. This is how I understand. This is how I think about it. And I think that's worth doing.
This is part of, to me, why we have conversations with people who are not Christian, who believe differently from us, because, part of it is, we're Trinitarian, but you really start to understand what that means when someone says, well, why isn't that polytheism? What does it mean to say that God is a Trinity as opposed to a unity? We are monotheists, but how do you reconcile monotheism with Trinitarianism? And that's a sticky one. That's the big one. But I think it's important for us to understand who do we think God is, and that's why I say conversations with people who believe differently than we do are the way that we grow in our faith and understand our faith. But back to the original question, right?
Back to the original question.
So how do we? Yeah.
So how do we respond to this family member who is a member of a different faith? And I think the correct answer is respectfully and carefully, but ask them, tell you about your practice. Tell me what you do. What is your faith? Because most people, Muslims included, are glad to explain their faith to somebody who is genuinely curious and is actually respectful of it. Not because I want to convert you, but because I want to know about you, my family member, the person that I'm learning to love. And so having a conversation will not only allow you to understand them better, it almost certainly will allow you to understand yourself better.
And your faith, because when you say family member, the thing that popped into my head is it's not just family member, husband of my daughter or child of my son, that you are saying family member, child of Abraham, like me, right?
Yes.
So let's talk about what that God is that we both believe. Well, that's our show for the day, and that's our first Ask the Pastor. Really like to say thank you to the person who submitted the question. I think it was a good one, and I hope we've done it some justice. If you have a question that you'd like us to at least attempt to answer, certainly you can go to our website. There's a way to contact us there. The website is ttnt.org. Or if you're here in Wheatland, you can always just holler at me across the Thrifty, or come up to me at a basketball game or whatever, and ask the question. And as I said, I'm Pastor Lisa from the Wheatland United Church of Christ. We worship at 10 a.m. and we're located at the corner of 11th and Walnut.
And I'm Pastor Joshua at Covenant Lutheran Church, which is at 18th and South Street. We worship at 9, and we'd love to see you. And you can find us here every Monday at 11:30 on KYCN 92.7 or at Table Talk and Tumbleweeds, wherever you get your podcasts.
Table Talk and Tumbleweeds is a ministry of Wheatland United Church of Christ and Covenant Lutheran Church, and supported by an In the Mud grant from the United Church of Christ.
We'll see you next week, and remember,
there's always room at this table.